Hello, my name is Nicole Mela. I'm the Deputy Online Editor at MaltaToday, and I'm here with JP Fabri, an economist and partner at Seed Consultancy, to break down a bit the budget plan that was announced last Monday, and maybe then go into a bit more discussion on the economy at large in Malta, so to speak. So let's just start off with the news of the week, so to speak. Last Monday, the Finance Minister, Clyde Caruana, laid out his budget plan for the coming year. Obviously, one of the biggest, most expensive measures come out from the budget is the fuel subsidy, which will see the government fork out €320 million in 2024 alone. Obviously, expensive measures like this, they come with opportunity costs. So obviously, it's an important measure in terms of maintaining a level of economic stability. But is it conditioning the government's economic maneuver, so to speak? Is there a bit of a straitjacket on what the government can do in a time like this?
So when analyzing the budget, ultimately, because the budget remains an economic document, right, and a financial document. So it's important to nest it within the current economic environment. So, and not only the economic environment, but also the current economic performance of the country. So if we have to look around us, there is no doubt that we are living in a very volatile period from an economic point of view, especially externally, right? So we've come out from a pandemic, we've had the war in Ukraine and Russia that continued much longer than anyone expected, and now we have the latest disturbances in the Middle East, which might escalate even more. So in all of this, right, you have a volatile, you have an uncertain external economic environment. Now, when we start looking at the Maltese economy, we need to remember that Malta's economy is inherently extremely small from a domestic market size, and it is also extremely open as an economy, right? So we import everything. So we're very susceptible to price fluctuations that happen abroad. Now, when you don't have the full natural resources to generate energy, if not renewable, but also those come at a cost. Your energy component is a huge cost of economic activity. So what government did was intentionally, it decided to allocate the lion's share, so to speak, of its war chest to protect the Maltese economy towards this component of expenditure, which is the fuel subsidies. So if we have to look around at other countries in Europe, you see companies, you see families that are paying double, triple, quadruple the energy bill. So what government did was it took on itself that burden to protect the Maltese families and industry from this spike in energy prices, right? So over there you have an inherent cushion that is being built, which ultimately leads to also the continued competitiveness of the Maltese economy as well. So yes, there is an opportunity cost because that 300 million could have gone somewhere else, but in reality there's also the other opportunity cost, because if electricity prices would have increased, then what would have been the impact on families, on purchasing power, on external competitiveness of Maltese firms? So I think ultimately this is where, and then the political dimension comes in. Where does government believe that it should intervene to stabilize the economy? So in economics, we talk about automatic stabilizers, right? Stabilizing mechanisms. Here we're seeing that government believes that subsidizing fuel is the best stabilization mechanism for the Maltese economy. Now the question is, does this, or is this sustainable into the future, right? So if we look back, we're realizing that government has injected huge amounts of money from the pandemic till today. The result of that is an economy that is performing well. In fact, we are always one of the fastest growing economies at European level. we have one of the lowest unemployment benefits, but then we have an inflationary impact that is coming from other sources as well. So despite the fact that energy prices did not increase, we still have a high inflation rate, which is eating into the purchasing power of families. However, the end result of all of this is that Malta's economy is performing well. It's generating growth, it's generating wealth, it's generating employment. So in all of this, we would say that the stabilization measure is leaving its desired impact effect. The question remains on its sustainability. And here I think the biggest risk that we face is the duration or the complexity or the level of escalation of the Middle East conflict. There we're seeing prices of oil already going towards the $100 a barrel, which and then will impinge a huge impact on Malta's coffers eventually. So in all of this, we need to start looking at eventually when will these be phased out, right, in terms of subsidies. What I'd like to see from an economic point of view is a bigger effort on the conditionality. So aid or subsidies will be given conditioned that we, for example, invest much more in renewables, right? So if you're saying what's happening in other countries, in Germany and Italy, whereby the electricity prices shot through the roof, then there's a bigger take-up of long-term renewable projects, offtake agreements and all of that. So I think we need to start finding the balance and shifting more towards the conditionality of support. But at this point in time, a measure like this continues to stabilize Malta's economic performance.
In fact, technically, because you're saying that it would be interesting to see how it will be phased out, because in reality, the budget sort of allocates around 320 million euro on fuel subsidies for every year until 2026. So we're seeing the opposite of a phase out almost. We're seeing, like, for the medium term future, we will have these fuel subsidies in place at least until, in Clyde Caruana's words during a press briefing before the budget, until we fix our electricity supply and lower the unit cost of electricity.
I think one risk over there is as well the impact of the Middle Eastern crisis, right? Because if global oil prices, energy prices start increasing, then I'm pretty sure that the impact on the budget will be significant, and there might be a need to revisit some of these projections.
Yes, exactly. And as you said as well, despite the fuel subsidies, there's still inflation. Inflation is still very much present in the Maltese economy. There's always a debate on how inflation can be tackled. I mean, there's not much governments can do, especially governments that don't really have the monetary autonomy as well, like most Eurozone countries. It's being subdued thanks to the energy subsidies, but it seems that food inflation, like food prices, are the biggest driver of inflation right now. The budget doesn't necessarily acknowledge this. I mean, yes, it acknowledges energy subsidies, but there's not much on the food prices, the food inflation. Could the government have done something here? I mean, like, say, commit itself to investigate cartel practices? That seems to be the new sort of buzzword a bit.
Here we need to distinguish, because sometimes in the debates out there, there's a blaring of inflation and the effects of inflation, right? So inflation in Malta, being a very open and small economy, is imported in nature. So in pure technical terms, there's not much the government can do. What the government can do is support families in the face of inflation, and that is by ensuring that the purchasing power is protected or else is improved. And that is where you see measures like the additional COLA coming in, the increase in minimum wage, right? So those are measures that help families deal with inflation. But the root cause of inflation at the end of the day remains highly imported. Now, what's happening from an inflationary point of view? This is something that has, I would say, happened across Europe, right? So there is the impact of supply chain implications post-COVID, right? So there was a time right after COVID that prices of shipping, logistics just increased. You had a lot of factories that were closed in China, so you had supply shrinkage and then a boom in demand after demand. So there was a mismatch and prices obviously go up. And in Malta, being an island where everything is imported by sea, you always have a bit of a lagged effect of what's happening abroad and what happens in Malta. So over here, I think what government can look into is more the logistics side of things, right? So can we improve the so-called port reform so that importers face lower costs of importation? Can it be that in the last mile distribution on the island, we look at ensuring greater economies of scale between the importers? Does it mean that each importer needs to have a whole distribution arm? Are there ways in which we can facilitate, incentivize a more cost-efficient last mile distribution? Then you have the market size. Malta is an island, a small island, which obviously has a bearing on market structures, right? So what do I mean? So ultimately you have in small market size, monopolistic practices, behaviors, the so-called cartels, collusion, is bound to happen even more in a small island, right? So, and over time, I believe there's going to be more consolidation of industry players, whereby market power will be concentrated in fewer people. So, what can government do over there? What you do have is lots of either parallel importation happening or side hustlers that go up to Sicily, get stuff down, don't pay the full eco contribution and all of that. So in order to create a more level playing field, right, is because ultimately you do have market players as well that benefit from different levels of tax. So in essence, you have an inherent tendency that monopolistic practices can happen in small markets. But at the end of the day, you have a discrimination happening in the local market in terms of costs, taxes, and all of that. So I think here it's not an easy. There are so many complex issues that enforcement needs to be looked into. The sort of discrimination from a tax point of view, right? So you have the large foreign players setting up shop that are paying a reduced rate of tax compared to the Maltese businesses. So I think it's such a layered conversation that here we need to have an evidence-based discussion with proper studies happening, trying to see what the pass-through to the end consumer is, what the cost structures are, what the tax structures are, and try to see and basically see if there are solutions as well to this.
Earlier I said cartel becomes a new buzzword, but we're also seeing another buzzword. It's sort of appearing more abroad from Malta, but we're seeing it creep up a bit, which is greed inflation. In fact, in a business breakfast a few days before the budget, Clyde Caruana himself said that there could be a possibility of some companies raising prices simply to bump up their profit margin. So is it a valid concern? Is greed inflation a valid concern when talking about inflation in Malta?
Correct. And there's another thing happening, which is shrinkflation, whereby we're seeing especially a lot of foodstuffs, whereby the sizes of the containers are actually shrinking and the price increasing. So now, when talking about greed inflation, basically what we also need to look into at a deeper analysis is that basically economic activity can be distributed primarily over two main elements, which is wages for workers and profits for businesses. Now, if you look at this distributional element over the past few years, we've seen the profit component actually increase its share over time, right? So what does this say? That companies are making more profits. Here we're talking at the general economic level. So yes, there can be what is called as price stickiness, in the sense that import prices increase, and then the end result is that the price per unit increases much more, right? So if, for example, the price per kilo of coffee increases by X, then the price of an espresso at the bar increases by 4 by X, when in reality the grammage of an espresso is much less than the kilo. So you have these discrepancies that ultimately can point to that greedflation. So, I mean, as I said, I think inflation is such a complex issue in a small market like Malta, which is an open market and small, that a proper analysis of the causes, what's happening, what are the market structures that we're seeing it, is there a level playing field within that market structure? So I think inflation, because it is such an important topic, because it hits everyone's pockets at the end of the day, I think this is where a proper technical evidence-based discussion needs to have. We need to lay out all the facts, all the chain implications from importation to retail. So at least we'll try and study and try and see exactly what is the main driver, and then see if there are solutions at the end of the day.
In fact, another possible driver of inflation here, another buzzword, so to speak, the wage price spiral. Earlier this year, there was a survey by the Malta Employers Association, and it did appear to indicate that Malta might be experiencing a wage price spiral, largely due to labour market shortages driving wage inflation. Could this be the case, in the sense that what are the risks of a wage price spiral, so to speak?
There are a number of other structural challenges that the Maltese economy is facing, and which can lead to the sort of inflationary impact, one of which is the labour market. So the labour market, true, we have one of the lowest unemployment rates in the EU. We have one of the record number of people in employment on the island. So this creates a number of shortages across a number of sectors, the result of which is a bigger share of third country nationals, foreign workers working in Malta, right? Because ultimately the economy needs manpower to continue. So, however, the labour market has a number of skill mismatches, right? So over there, it's much more of a structural mismatch that we're looking at. Not only not enough people, but we don't have enough people with the right skill sets happening. So what is happening, especially in, for example, the service-led industries, is that you have a very tight labour market. As a result, you have a lot of headhunting positions. People or employers are ready to pay more as a result of that, and that constitutes a higher wage bill, which eventually gets passed down. You also have the debate is, listen, COLA is increasing at quite a substantial level as a result of the inflationary pressures, as a result of which this will eventually be passed on to the consumer. So you have that risk happening. Now, is it going to be a fully fledged wage price spiral? So, you know, it continues pushing each other like a ping pong game. The risks are there, but there are also mitigating measures, because what happens ultimately, because there is a level of competition out there, unless we have this collusive behavior happening, ultimately there is a point in which the pass-through of higher prices will stop, because either consumers will start moving to another retailer, another shop, another supplier, right? So you always have this fine line whereby, yes, prices can continue increasing up to a certain point, because and then you're either losing business or you're outpricing yourself from the market. And as a result, you'll take a bigger share yourself of the increase in costs. So what I said earlier on, this distributional element that currently the profit size has increased much more, might actually and then provide the buffer, right, for businesses to eat into that so as not to lose market share or clients. So it's this very fine line but the risk is there.
And now maybe to go back to the budget, particularly the budget reaction. So the Nationalist Party, their first reaction to the budget was that it offers no solutions. In particular, it noted that people are feeling the burden of overpopulation, of an economic model based on low earners and cheap labor. So the crux of their economic analysis seems to be that over the past months, we have seen economic growth being driven particularly by population growth. Is this a realistic analysis?
So let's look at Malta's economic performance over the past few years, right? So we've seen a boom in construction activity that is extremely dependent on human resources, right? So it's not a service-based whereby your productivity per employee is much higher. So it is extremely dependent on human resources. So there was an increased supply of building, there was an increased demand for building, ergo you need builders to actually build. This increased the market size, more purchasing power, more domestic demand, and that is where economic growth has been coming from, right? So if you decompose our GDP, domestic demand is a huge component of that. So ideally, we start seeing a shift and making sure that our export activities become much more competitive, much more productive, so that we can generate much more wealth per employee, and then you need less employees. But what has happened? It is true that the Maltese population has shot up over the past few years. However, the infrastructural basis did not keep up with that. So yes, I think one of the biggest challenges that Malta faces in the medium term, but even more so in the long term, is the infrastructural element, right? So, and here I think, and this is where I think that the economic debate needs to as well mature. Where are the challenges that Malta's economy faces? And I think there are a number of challenges that can be summed up in the 4 I's: infrastructure, innovation, investment, well, 3 I's. So the infrastructure, currently we're seeing that there are bottlenecks in a number of areas. Electricity, we had a report by the MHRA on the carrying capacity of the tourism industry, calling for huge pressures on the sewage infrastructure, the water infrastructure, the energy as well, the transport infrastructure, mobility. So hospital, right? So hospital was built for a population of these numbers, and we feel the pinch when there is a spike of admissions due to a pandemic, due to an influenza, you know? So over here, I think these are, how are we going to tackle these challenges? So from an infrastructural point of view, there are initiatives to start increasing electricity supply, securing supply. right? So we have the second interconnector coming on stream. We have more incentives to facilitate the green transition. We have a battery project coming on stream that will help. I think the problem is not much in the generation side, it is much more in the distribution side, right? So what happened is we had huge investments in the generation, but the distribution capacity did not keep up with that. Road infrastructure, we've seen the huge success of free public transport, but we still have huge amounts of cars coming on to the Maltese roads on a daily basis. So is it time to start introducing higher taxes to actually operate a car, right? So here as well, if we look at the political debate, the political and the economic debate, it's sort of the concept of taxation has become a taboo. If taxes are used to shift behavior from a negative externality to something more positive, then there is a positive implication of a tax. I think taxes need to be seen much less than a financial instrument, but much more as a behavioral nudge, right? So lots of Maltese travel and drive abroad. You park, you pay on roads. Car licenses are becoming much more expensive, congestion taxes. So can it be in this island, which is constrained naturally by size, we can't continue having an inflow of cars coming in, but the size remains small? So yes, from an infrastructural point of view, the limits are there. There are investment plans. It might be interesting to see more PPPs, public-private partnerships, coming on to support the government in investing in infrastructure. But there again, I think taxes need to be seen as a behavioral nudge rather than this taboo around. It's like, you know, we can't talk about increasing taxes for one reason or another. So I think here there needs to be a maturity or a much more sensitivity to behavioral changes that we need to start introducing.
The Nationalist Party has also made several proposals on the creation of new economic sectors. This was ahead of the budget in their pre-budget document. They highlight the metaverse, AI, 3D printing and robotics, among other sectors. At this point in time, how important is it for Malta to continue building these new economic sectors? And where could we be missing out? Where do we need to maybe focus a bit more on these new sectors?
I think if we look at the whole social partner dialogue discourse out there, is that there is a growing mention of the need of a vision, or for a vision, right? So, and I think, yes, in all fairness, Malta still does not have a long-term vision which is fully articulated in one document. Now, by vision, I don't think that it's purely an economic vision. I think it's more, where do we see Malta? What is the Malta we would like to live in by 2030, by 2040? And if we see a number of European countries, and not only European, these visions have been something that COVID has accelerated, whereby a lot of countries have taken the opportunity to sit down, internalize, and envision a different quality of life. So there's a bigger emphasis on well-being, on wellness, on the quality of life, rather than purely an economic vision of growth mindset. There is much more an understanding or a sensitivity towards the general well-being of the country and the community that lives within that country. Now, from an economic point of view, an economy transitions over time transforms itself. So I think here the key elements are two: transition and transformation, right? So if we look at the manufacturing sector, it has remained in Malta and it will remain, but it will transform itself. We started with manufacturing jeans and shirts. Today, we are manufacturing pharmaceuticals. Even in pharmaceuticals, right? We started with generic, and the generic medicine pharmaceutical industry started with a regulatory framework, and this is something that I'll discuss. Today, we're trying to move much higher on the value chain. So today, we're not only producing generic drugs, but we have companies coming here to actually start producing cancer drugs, tests, medical devices, and all of that. So the investment that was mentioned in the budget with relation to one of the largest manufacturing companies in the semiconductors, and we can mention it, it's ST, because it is a household name, so to speak, right? That is something which, if you look back, even there, ST has transitioned over time. Now, this investment, which is born out of a European initiative to ensure that Europe is not dependent on semiconductors, which, as a result of quantum, AI, and all this processing need of computing power, are only going to increase. So semiconductors is something which in the future and also in the present is a critical resource for any economy. So that is good and needed, because a manufacturing company that has been in Malta, we're supporting it to continuously transform itself and transition to be able to generate the new semiconductors that are needed in the future. Now, of that investment, there is something else which has not been mentioned, which to me is even more important in the greater scheme of things. ST participated in a direct EU fund program. Now, in Malta, our take-up, our absorption of EU funds has been generally quite good and high. And this is because you have a lot of government projects which are EU financed, infrastructural projects, schemes administered by Malta Enterprise, by other government units, whereby the Maltese businesses apply with the Maltese government agencies that administer these funds. But in reality, the European Union budget is much broader than that, and industry can benefit much more from huge budgets, but these are direct funds. And what happens abroad is that consortia are formed between academia, businesses, and apply directly to the European Union institutions. And I think what we really need is to facilitate Maltese businesses to participate in these direct EU funding, because ultimately that EU funding is financing the innovation element, which we so desperately need. So the ST case is brilliant, but let's replicate it. Because ultimately, even when we're talking about economic vision, new economic sectors take time to materialize. And economic sectors never reach an end. The aim needs to be to transform them, to transition them into much more higher value adds, right? So even if we look at financial services, over time, the Maltese sector has transformed to offer different services or types of services. Today, we're a jurisdiction that offers funds. We're a jurisdiction that offers virtual asset licenses, EMIs, PSPs. So the reality is, how do we get this body of legislation to continuously make it more attractive to carve out new subsectors within an overarching sector, right? And this budget mentioned, I would say, 3 sectors where I am seeing at least some seeds that are being sowed to continuously transform the sector. Financial services, you had a very consultative approach towards the financial services that led to the strategy being launched earlier this year, whereby we're seeing the implementation of a number of new areas. The minister alluded to new initiatives within the aircraft sector, which over there is also very substantial in Malta. We started that sector from a maintenance, repair and overhaul, the Lufthansa techniques, the SR techniques, whereby over there we identified a niche that Malta can play a key role in the region to set up shop, and it succeeded. Then we moved on to aircraft registration, building on the ship register. There again, it's the regulatory framework that managed to attract companies. Today, we need to start seeing how we can transform that. So we're looking at aircraft leasing. So how can we bring the financial services sector and the aircraft sector closer to start offering products and services that complement each other? There again, the aviation sector needs to be now, or else the government authorities need to be cognizant of the environmental implications that are going to impact the sector, especially we see EU's stance on carbon on the aviation. So how can Malta find a niche within the region to start pioneering a new subsector of aviation? Can it be in sustainable aviation fuel as a hub for that? The maritime is another case in point, right? So the minister mentioned that a super yacht strategy is going to be launched, some other initiatives. And this brings me to another point. The budget is not the be-all and end-all of a government's economic program. What I really believe is that we should have a discussion on the long-term vision. There have been, but I think we need an articulated vision of where we see ourselves. Now, it can't be a vision that straitjackets us, right? Because the environment is what it is. But at least, I think, and there are separate, and I think this is one of the biggest structural issues in Malta. We have a lot of fragmentation happening. So we have different ministries launching different schemes, there are overlaps, and all of that. What I think we need is to consolidate much more, consolidate and streamline. So we need to have a vision of, yes, this is where we aspire to. And we aspire to not only economically, as I said, but also socially. So how are we going to ensure that everyone is included in economic activity? How are we going to ensure that our rehabilitation programs work much more from a social perspective? How are we going to improve? How are we going to ensure that our early school leaver rates start going down? Because ultimately, we have an issue. We have structural issues with our educational system. Although education is free, actually, we are paid to go to university, right? We still have one of the lowest rates of students graduating. Our results in STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, we're falling behind. And STEM is going to be so important in the digital economy that we need to build. So how can we build a digital economy if we don't have the right skill sets? So ultimately, the economy is a pipeline. It's a throughput of things. How are we going to ensure our demographics, our fertility rates, our birth rates, how are we going to increase those? Because those have implications on our pension affordability down the line. How are we going to ensure that our healthcare is focused much more on the preventive side rather than on the acute care? Because ultimately, if we have one of the most obese populations in Europe, the health system is going to face the consequences of that, because we're going to have more diabetes, more hospitalization. So how are we going to tackle the problem at its core when it starts? And this is where division comes in. So I'd like to see a vision for the coming 10, 15, 20 years, saying that we want to have a population that is healthy, a community that is greener. Maybe we want to see much smarter cities happening around us, or communities which are redeveloped or regenerated, right? Rather than building new, but retrofitting buildings that are carbon neutral, regenerating communities. So this is a discussion which goes beyond the economic. We need to start looking at the cultural elements, the sociological elements. That, I think, is still lacking. We still don't have that articulated vision like other countries do. Then, what you do have is a long-term vision. You then have medium-term implementation plans, which can transcend electoral cycles, right? So ultimately, which was very good, we sort of had consensus on the national wage adjustment. It is about time that we have consensus on the way forward of Malta. So we have these medium-term implementation plans, which are 7 years, which gives you stability, you know where you're going, right? And then the budget ultimately becomes your short-term implementation plan of action for the coming 12 months. And in all of this, we also need to start having a debate on the quality of public expenditure. So is the impact of public expenditure leaving the desired effects? So I'd like to see much more this outcome-based budgeting process around. Yes, let's have a discussion. Listen, this scheme failed. It didn't work. Let's tweak it. You know, so I think here we need to elevate the public debate. Unfortunately, the budgetary debate gets alienated or overtaken by the headline figures. The COLA, the national way, yes, good. The headline deficit, the headline debt, good. But let's have a deeper discussion. Let's look at the impacts that ultimately public money is your money, my money, it's tax, you know? So is it leaving its desired impact? And I think this is, if you had to tell me how would you envision the budgetary debate, I'd rather have more of this impact assessment, impact-driven budgetary process happening into the future, because at least we know that we're building year after year towards a long-term vision we all agree to, or we all like to see this country transition into the future.
With very interesting points there. Thank you much for sitting down with us to give a bit of a digest on the budget.
Thanks for the invite.
Thank you very much for listening to this interview. This interview will be available across all our social media as well as on our website. In the meantime, follow MaltaToday for all the latest news and stories.